Welcome back. We're ending on mortality, strategy, and what it actually means to live awake. And this one gets weirdly personal because the whole conversation keeps circling back to fear, limits, and self-deception. He keeps saying the same brutal thing in different ways. Stop lying to yourself about time. That is such a rude message to start a final episode with, but it works. It's rude because it's true, and that's exactly why it lands. The part that got me was how much his whole worldview changes once death becomes real in his body. That is the difference, right, between knowing something and feeling it. Most of us know we will die, but we behave like the exception. Massive delusion, excellent branding. Exactly, and he is basically saying the cure is not panic, it's precision. I actually think that is what people miss when they hear mortality talk and immediately shut down. He is not being gloomy. He's trying to make every ordinary thing sharper. Right, like the gym, the sunlight, the fact that you can still move around. Which is hilarious because we only appreciate those things after they get taken away. And people call that wisdom after the fact, which feels like cheating. The human species basically learns through loss and then acts surprised every time. The deeper point is that urgency can actually make life richer instead of more anxious. That's the fascinating part because urgency usually sounds like pressure. He's treating it like a lens, not a whip. That changes the whole vibe, honestly. And then he connects it to love, which is where the conversation gets really interesting. He goes from death to romance, and somehow it still sounds like strategy. Of course it does. It's Robert Greene. He can't even fall in love without a framework. The man probably has a chapter outline for heartbreak. And yet the point is not cold at all. It's actually very vulnerable. He's saying real intimacy requires dropping the ego and risking pain, which is such an anti-modern message because everybody wants connection without exposure. People want the benefits of love with the safety of a locked door. Yeah, they want emotional cinema with airplane mode intimacy. That is absurdly accurate. But he's right that if you refuse vulnerability, you also refuse depth. And then your whole life stays at the surface. The weirdest part is that he talks about dark dreams and self-doubt so casually. That was actually the most human section to me. Because it strips away the public persona and just leaves somebody wrestling with himself. And the self-doubt is nasty because it sounds like identity, not just a mood. He's basically saying darkness is normal, but you have to metabolize it instead of worshiping it. Or letting it run your calendar, which is also a problem. Right. And his advice to suicidal people was really interesting because he didn't romanticize anything. He kept coming back to action, to evidence, to taking one step that proves to yourself you can still move. That's such a small-sounding idea, but I think it's massive. Because when somebody is falling apart, philosophy alone doesn't always reach them. You need a foothold, not a lecture. And the same logic shows up in his whole idea of strategy. He's obsessed with people not reacting emotionally and actually thinking 3 moves ahead. Which, by the way, is impossible when someone insults you online and your fingers start shaking. Oh, completely impossible. You become a different species for 5 minutes. But he would say that's the point, right? That most people are just bad strategists. He's not saying emotions are fake. He's saying they become disastrous when they control the whole game. And that blends right into politics, because politics is basically emotions with costumes. That is the cleanest description of politics I've heard all week. He's angry that nobody seems to build a real vision anymore, only reactions and identities. That was his main criticism of both sides, actually. One side is laundry list management, the other side is pure performance, and neither one feels rooted. It's almost like nobody is offering a story people can live inside. Exactly, and he thinks humans need myth, not just policies. Which sounds dramatic until you realize he's probably right. Because people vote emotionally, not spreadsheet by spreadsheet. Shocking revelation. Humans are not optimized machines. That should be on a billboard somewhere. The business analogy was smart too, because quarterly thinking kills long-term vision everywhere. And that's what makes his whole philosophy feel bigger than self-help. It's really about attention, discipline, and not being fooled by your own stories. Also about accepting that life is random in ways you cannot control. The stroke story made that very clear because the whole thing hinged on tiny accidents. A missed medication, a wasp sting, a steroid, and suddenly everything changes. That sequence is terrifying. It's the kind of story that makes you suspicious of your own morning routine. But he doesn't land on helplessness, he lands on response. You can't control the event, but you can control the meaning and the next move. That's basically the Stoic core, even when he says it in his own language. And I like that he forgave the wasp, which is both funny and strangely profound. I mean, imagine having unresolved beef with an insect from years ago. That is a very efficient enemy, to be fair. Final boss, nature. What I take from this episode is that awareness is not passive. It has to change how you act, otherwise it's just a nice thought. Death awareness, love awareness, strategy awareness, even political awareness. It all becomes useless if it doesn't alter behavior. And that feels like the right place to end this series. Not with certainty, but with a sharper way of looking at things. If there's one takeaway, it's probably that life gets better when you stop pretending. Which is annoyingly hard because pretending is very convenient. But the inconvenient truth is usually the useful one. That's it for this one, and for the series, and we'll see you in the next run. Until then, stay awake and don't waste the good parts. Welcome back. This episode gets right into mortality, love, strategy, and the weird beauty of being alive. And the whole thing is basically Greene saying, stop pretending you have forever. Which is a rude thing to tell a young person, honestly. But it lands because he's not saying it like a slogan. He's saying it like somebody who actually looked at the edge. Yeah, and that stroke changes the whole flavor of the conversation. Because suddenly it's not philosophy from a chair, it's philosophy from pain. Which is always more annoying and always more credible. Exactly, nobody wants wisdom with a hospital bill attached. But he keeps coming back to the same idea, urgency is a gift. I get that, but people hear urgency and just panic scroll their life. Yes, they turn it into productivity theater immediately. His point is sharper than that, though. He means urgency makes ordinary things feel alive again. Like swimming, walking, health, being able to move at all. That part about not appreciating the swim until you can't do it anymore is brutal. That's basically the human operating system right there. You only notice the miracle after the privilege gets stripped away. And he's ruthless about that with young people, too. He's like, you think I'm privileged, but you're the one sitting on the real luxury. That's such a mean sentence and somehow kind of correct. It is mean, but it's also the kind of mean that wakes people up. Then the love section hits, because he's basically making vulnerability sound like a discipline. Not romance as fantasy, but romance as ego death. Which is a wildly unsexy way to sell love, by the way. But it's also the first honest description of it in a while. He's saying the best part is exactly the part people run from. The loss of defenses, the risk of pain, the surrender. And that makes his chapter on love feel connected to the whole mortal theme. Because if time is short, then hiding is even more expensive. Still, I can hear someone saying, okay, but what about self-protection? Yes, and what about being alive enough to regret something? That's a savage response, but fair. Then there's the whole dark thoughts part, which he doesn't sugarcoat at all. The guilt dreams, the self-doubt, the depression, the body frustration. He's almost unnervingly candid about it. And that's why it works, because he isn't pretending darkness is some abstract aesthetic. He's saying, no, it's just in the room with me too. Then he gives that advice to the suicidal person, and that was interesting. He doesn't think pure talk will save anybody. He thinks action has to create the first little crack of belief. A step, an action, some tiny evidence that you can still move. Which is honestly what a lot of healing looks like anyway. Not grand insight, just proof. And then the sublime itself becomes this long-delayed project. I love that he had the idea 20 years earlier and life kept shoving it sideways. First 50 Cent, then mastery, then human nature, like the man was getting rerouted by destiny. But the stroke turns the delay into the subject. He can't go chasing whales in deserts now, so the book has to happen in the room. That's almost sad and beautiful at the same time. It is because the limitation becomes part of the intelligence of the book. Then the demon idea comes in, which is such a Robert Greene move. Of course he has a Greek spirit guiding him through a stroke recovery. Of course he does, and somehow it doesn't even feel ridiculous. Because he's treating the inner life like a real field of study. And the animal chapter is a great example of that too. He looks at the cat differently after writing about it, which is the whole point. Knowledge changes perception or it's just decoration. That line could basically summarize the entire series. Then he gets into strategy, and I think this is where he becomes most himself. Because now he's in his natural habitat, which is probably something close to warfare. Yeah, he hears game and immediately starts diagramming the battlefield. But his criticism is useful. Most people do have strategies, they're just bad ones. They're emotional, reactive, and built on illusion. Which is why people keep wondering why their life won't move. He's saying the first skill is to stop being yanked around by every feeling. Very rude of him to ask humans to be intelligent while triggered. Apparently, the market has no sympathy for our emotions. The politics part makes that even clearer, because he hates the empty performance on both sides. He wants a vision, not a list of complaints. And that feels like the real political criticism here. Not that people disagree, but that they've stopped imagining anything together. It's just tribal panic and reaction now. He's also not pretending he's neutral, which I respect. He admits his own bias, then keeps going anyway. And that's probably more honest than the fake objective expert pose. Which is a huge epidemic, honestly. The final answer about the last 10 years is the cleanest version of the whole thing. He'd slow down, respect his limits, and maybe avoid the stroke. But even that answer becomes philosophy by the end. Because he still forgives the sequence, then calls it fate. That contradiction is basically the human condition in one breath. Was it avoidable, or was it destiny, or was it both? Yes. That's the only correct answer, annoyingly. And then the tiny event question lands the whole thing in the body again. One wasp, one medication miss, one doctor, one moment. That's how fragile the architecture is. Which is exactly why his answer matters. You can't control the world, only your response. That's the stoic finish, and it fits the series surprisingly well. And that's probably the cleanest bridge between all 3 episodes. Self-knowledge, power, mortality, and then what you do with the truth. Yeah, and the answer is never pretend harder. Although humans keep trying that plan like it's new. It is a good final note, though. Reality is not kind, but it is workable. If you can see it clearly, you can at least stop wasting energy fighting ghosts. That's the series for us, then. We went from masks to mortality, which is a pretty decent arc. Not a bad human arc either, frankly. Thanks for listening all the way through. We'll see you in the next run. Welcome back. This last one is about mortality, strategy, and the weird beauty of the sublime. He basically says urgency makes life sharper, not darker. Which is annoying because it sounds true. That part about waking up and thinking this could be the last thought is wild. It forces the question, what do you want sitting in your head at the end? Most people would answer that badly if they were honest. They'd probably say notifications and unfinished resentment. Exactly, just petty administrative suffering. But his point is not melodrama, it's attention. Like if you remember you're mortal, you stop treating health like wallpaper. People really do act like their bodies are exempt from time. Then one thing breaks and suddenly they're spiritually shocked. The arrogance is kind of hilarious when you say it out loud. I did like the idea that awareness of death can make ordinary things glow. That is the strange bargain, though. You don't get the glow without the ending in the frame. And then he flips it into love, which is where it gets even messier. Because, of course, the guy who wrote about seduction ends up writing about surrender. That's a very Robert Greene move, honestly. He makes vulnerability sound less like weakness and more like depth. But people are so allergic to pain now that they skip the whole thing. They want intimacy with zero exposure, which is adorable and impossible. Adorable is generous, but yes, impossible. The darkest part was him talking about his own dreams and self-doubt. That's what makes it land, because he isn't performing mastery at you. He is admitting the inner noise is still there. And the body stuff, man, that was brutal. Losing access to swimming, hiking, biking, all of it, that hits hard. Then suddenly the advice to a suicidal person becomes less abstract. His answer was basically, give people evidence, not speeches. Which is actually excellent advice in general. Most of life is people trying to talk others out of a feeling with slogans. And slogans are terrible therapists. They really are, they just stand there in a suit. The part where he says the person has to create a first step themselves matters a lot. Because belief built through action actually sticks. Empty encouragement usually just bounces off. Then he goes into the book he's writing, and it all connects. The sublime was already in his head years ago, which I didn't know. It got delayed by 50 Cent, which is such a funny sentence. Life really does hand you a detour and say good luck. But the stroke forced the book into a different shape. That part felt almost painful to hear, but also clarifying. He can't go chase sublime experiences out in the world anymore, so he has to find them in the room. That is such a brutal artistic limitation and also a gift. Basically, the universe said, "Stay at the desk, philosopher." And somehow that improved the book. I think that's one of the best creative arguments in the whole conversation. Do you think suffering makes people better writers or just more honest? Because it can also make them unbearable, let's be fair. True, some people get a tragedy and immediately become insufferable about it. The market is flooded with that product. His version feels different because he turns it into observation, not ego. And then the demon thing comes in, which is such a great concept to test on yourself. A second self, a guiding force, a pattern you didn't invent on purpose. I can see why some people roll their eyes at it. But psychologically, it works as a language for purpose. Like maybe your life is not random even when it feels random. Maybe the job is just noticing the pattern faster. Then he moves to his bigger theme, which is reality over fantasy. That should honestly be on his business card at this point. Reality over fantasy, and please stop pretending. I love that he keeps dragging the conversation back to what actually works. His politics point is basically that people are all emotion and no strategy, which explains a depressing amount of public life. Everybody wants moral purity, but nobody wants the dirty work. They want the halo, not the spreadsheet. That's a very good line, annoyingly. His critique of politics and business is the same critique. Quarterly thinking kills vision. And without a long-term story, everything becomes reactive noise. That's what he means by the myth, I think. People need a vision they can feel, not just a list of promises. But most leaders are too scared to say what they are for. Because being against things is way easier and cheaper. Campaign strategy, basically. The best close for me was his answer about the last 10 years. He didn't romanticize it. He just said he would have slowed down and respected his limits. That feels like the most human answer in the whole episode. Also the hardest one because hindsight is cruel. The wasp, the medication, the stress, all of it shows how fragile the chain is. And then the real question becomes, can you live with the randomness? His answer was stoic, but not cold. You can't control the event, only the meaning you make from it. Which is basically the entire podcast in one sentence. Not a bad place to land after 3 episodes. We started with masks and ended with mortality and art. That is a pretty strong trilogy, honestly. Thanks for riding through all of it with us. We will catch you in the next one. Welcome back. This one is about mortality, strategy, and the strange relief of seeing life clearly. And somehow it turns into love, politics, wasps, and the meaning of being alive. Which is a very normal conversation, obviously. The mortality thing hit me because he does not treat death like a slogan. He treats it like a daily discipline. That line about waking up and asking what you want in your last seconds is wild. Bro, imagine starting your morning with that question every day. You would either become a monk or a menace. Probably both, honestly. But I do think the point was not to be dramatic about death. It was to stop wasting your attention on petty noise. Which is hard, because petty noise is the internet's favorite meal. The whole culture is built on outrage snacks. And his answer was basically, you can either feed that or build something. That was the other big thing, the urgency of unfinished work. He kept saying, if you think you have forever, you become sloppy. Which is the most expensive lie young people tell themselves, especially when they act like their body is a subscription service. The health part mattered too, because he was talking like somebody who lost access to his own old life. That gives the whole thing a different weight. He is not romanticizing pain, though. He is saying pain changes your scale of value. Basically, getting humbled by your own body is one of life's least fun lessons, and apparently one of the most effective. What struck you most in the love section? The idea that falling in love means letting your defenses dissolve. That is terrifying to people now because everyone is optimized for self-protection. We are all out here building little emotional bunkers, then acting shocked when nothing beautiful gets in. He basically said vulnerability is the price of depth. And that is a real trade-off, not a motivational poster. Because pain is part of the contract, not a glitch. Exactly, and I think people hate that answer because it removes fantasy. Then the dark thoughts section got uncomfortably honest. He was not doing the polished guru thing at all. He was talking about self-doubt like a constant weather pattern. And that is weirdly reassuring because it means success does not delete insecurity. Sadly, no trophy comes with a lifelong internal therapist. That would have been useful information earlier. But his advice was practical. Make evidence. Make something real. He kept coming back to action instead of talk. That felt like the hidden spine of the whole conversation. Even with suicidal thoughts, he was saying a first step has to create belief, which is such a human answer because it respects how stuck people can be. It also refuses the lazy idea that words alone save people. Words matter, but sometimes action is the only thing that can break the fog. Then there is the book itself, this whole slow march toward the sublime. And I love that it started years ago, then got interrupted by life. Because that is how real work happens, not in neat little straight lines. He planned whales, deserts, and grand experiences, then ended up at a desk. That is brutal and beautiful at the same time. And somehow the limitation made the book deeper. That is the part I keep coming back to. Sometimes the thing you cannot do becomes the thing that sharpens your seeing. The demon idea was another version of that, this inner guiding force. I do not know if I buy all the mystical language, but I get the intuition. You don't have to buy the packaging if the engine runs. That is actually a great line for half of modern spirituality. He was basically saying meaning is not found by accident, it is cultivated. The politics section was the sharpest pivot, though, because he went from mortality to political strategy like that was a casual walk. He really said, if you want change, stop being sentimental and learn the rules. And that is where he gets interesting because he hates empty morality. He wants vision plus organization, not just vibes. Which, frankly, is a devastating critique of most public life. Everybody has a brand, nobody has a map. He kept saying strategy is just disciplined realism. And the opposite is emotional stupidity, not innocence. That is such a brutal sentence to leave hanging in the air. But I think he means people sabotage themselves by reacting too fast. His own method was basically delay, observe, then act. Meditation was not a side note there, it was the system. He was training himself to not be yanked around by every emotional spark. Honestly, if more people had a draft folder, civilization would improve. Then the wasp story comes in and it gets almost absurd. A tiny chain of events, and suddenly your whole life changes. That is the terrifying part about reality. It is fragile in stupid ways. One small thing and the path splits forever. His answer was stoic but not cold. You can't control the event, only the meaning you make from it. Which is basically the entire podcast in one sentence. Not a bad place to land after 3 episodes. We started with masks and ended with mortality and art. That is a pretty strong trilogy, honestly. Thanks for riding through all of it with us. We will catch you in the next one.